Edward never imagined that one ordinary lunch would change his life forever. He sat at a beautiful restaurant on a sunny afternoon, the city buzzing around him. His table was perfectly set, his meal served with the precision and elegance he was accustomed to. Edward had everything: money, influence, the kind of life most people only dream of. And yet, in that moment, he felt strangely empty. That was when he heard the timid voice. "Excuse me, sir?" He looked up, expecting perhaps a waiter or a stranger asking for directions. Instead, he saw a young woman standing near his table. Her clothes were worn, her hair a little messy, her hands nervously gripping the strap of an old bag. Her eyes, though tired, held something that stopped him cold, a quiet dignity. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly, "but could you spare some food? I haven't eaten all day." For a moment, Edward was stunned. No one had ever approached him like this before. Most people knew who he was, or at least recognized the expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored suit he wore. People usually wanted deals, investments, attention, not food. Something about her words, her tone, the raw honesty in her face broke through the invisible wall he had built around himself. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he said. She hesitated, clearly not expecting that response, but eventually she sat down. Edward signaled the waiter, who quickly approached. "Bring her whatever she wants," Edward ordered. The waiter glanced at Jessie. Because that was her name, she finally told him, and nodded. At first Jessie seemed uncomfortable, as if being treated kindly was something foreign to her. But Edward noticed the way her shoulders slowly relaxed when the food arrived, the way her hands trembled slightly as she took the first bite. He didn't speak right away, just watched. There was something humbling, almost sacred, about seeing someone so hungry finally being given what they needed. "Thank you," Jessie said quietly, her voice breaking. "You didn't have to do this." Edward shrugged, but something inside him shifted. "Maybe I did," he said. They began to talk. Jessie told him she had been looking for work for weeks, that things had fallen apart after she lost her last job, that she had been staying at a shelter but sometimes spent the night on park benches when there was no space. Edward listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. There was no business deal here, no social advantage to gain. Just a story, a life, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to know more. When Jessie finished eating, she thanked him again and stood up to leave. "Wait," Edward said, standing as well. "You can't just disappear." She gave a sad little smile. "People like me usually do." That sentence hit him like a punch to the chest. "Not this time," Edward said. He took out his wallet, but Jessie shook her head. "I'm not asking for money," she said. "I just needed food today." Her pride, her quiet strength, only fascinated him more. "Then let me at least walk you somewhere safe," he offered. Jessie hesitated, then nodded. They walked together through the city, an unusual pair, the polished billionaire and the woman who had just asked him for a meal. People stared, but Edward didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. When they reached the shelter, Jessie turned to him. "You've already done so much," she said. "You should go back to your world now." Edward looked at the worn building, the people lined up outside waiting for a bed, and then back at Jessie. "Maybe I don't want to," he said. Jessie looked startled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or curiosity. "Good night, Edward," she said softly before slipping inside. Edward stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, before finally walking away. But that night, as he lay in his luxurious apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and perfect view of the city, he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had thanked him, about the way she had refused his money, about the way her eyes had met his and made him feel seen, really seen, for the first time in years. And as the city lights glittered below him, Edward realized something that both terrified and excited him. He wanted to see Jessie again, and he would. Edward woke up earlier than usual the next morning. He had meetings scheduled, calls to take, contracts to review, the usual rhythm of his carefully organized life. But none of it seemed urgent anymore. There was only one thought in his mind. Jessie. It was ridiculous, he told himself. He barely knew her, and yet, he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, of the way she had said, "People like me usually do." That sentence haunted him. So, instead of heading to the office, Edward found himself driving back to the same shelter where he had left her the night before. The line outside was shorter this morning, but Jessie wasn't there. He went inside, speaking to the woman at the reception desk. "She left early," the woman said. "Said she was going to try her luck finding a job today." "Do you know where she usually goes?" Edward asked. The woman shook her head. "Sorry, we don't keep track of people once they leave for the day." For the first time in years, Edward felt something he wasn't used to: helplessness. He was a man who could sign papers and move millions with a single phone call, but he couldn't find one girl in a city of millions. He spent the rest of the day looking for her. He walked through busy streets, checked the nearby parks, stopped at small cafes, even asked at the diner near the shelter if anyone had seen her. Nothing. By evening, Edward was exhausted, frustrated, and strangely more determined. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It felt like something bigger, something that mattered. The next day, he tried again. And this time, just as the sun was setting, he found her. Jessie was sitting on a bench near the fountain at the park, holding a small paper bag that probably contained the first food she had been able to buy for herself that day. Edward felt an almost embarrassing wave of relief. "There you are," he said. Jessie looked up, startled, then frowned. "You again? What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Edward said simply. Her expression softened slightly, though she still looked wary. "Why?" Edward hesitated. He could have said something smooth, something charming, but for some reason he didn't want to lie to her. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you." Jessie blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "You don't even know me." "Then let me," Edward said. Jessie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded toward the empty spot on the bench. "Sit, then." Edward sat, and for a while they just watched the fountain in silence. "You don't have to do this," Jessie said eventually. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," Edward said, "but I want to." Something in the sincerity of his voice must have reached her, because she finally began to talk. She told him more about her life, how she had grown up in a small town, how she had come to the city chasing a job that disappeared after only a few months, how she had been sleeping in shelters and doing odd jobs to survive ever since. Edward listened, not interrupting, not offering solutions, just listening. When she finished, Jessie looked down at her hands. "You probably think I'm pathetic." Edward shook his head. "No, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." Jessie's eyes widened slightly, and Edward could see that his words had touched her. "Come on," Edward said suddenly, standing. "You must be hungry." "I already ate," Jessie said, holding up the paper bag. "Then let's get dessert," Edward said with a small smile. Jessie hesitated, then stood up. "All right, but just dessert." They walked together to a small bakery nearby. One Jessie admitted she often passed but rarely entered because she couldn't afford it. Edward bought them both slices of cake and 2 hot chocolates. They sat by the window, eating slowly, and Edward couldn't remember the last time he had felt so human. There was no pretense here, no expectation. Just 2 people sharing cake and talking about everything and nothing. When Jessie laughed, really laughed, at something Edward said, he felt something warm in his chest, something that scared him because it was real. When it was time to go, Edward offered to drive her back to the shelter, but Jessie refused. "I can walk," she said. "At least let me walk with you," Edward insisted. They walked side by side through the quiet streets, and when they reached the shelter, Jessie turned to him. "You're strange," she said, but she was smiling. "Strange how?" Edward asked. "Strange because most people would have given me a few dollars and forgotten about me, but you came back." Edward looked at her seriously. "I'm not going to forget you, Jessie." She didn't reply right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "Good night, Edward." And for the first time, She smiled at him before disappearing inside. Edward stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door before finally walking away, his heart beating faster than it had in years. That night, Edward didn't just think about Jessie, he dreamed about her. And when he woke up the next morning, he knew that whatever this was between them, it was only just beginning. Edward's world began to shift in small, almost invisible ways. His assistant noticed first. "You've been rescheduling a lot of meetings lately," she remarked carefully one morning. "Should I be concerned?" "No," Edward said simply, though he knew she was right. He had started carving out hours just to see Jessie. Sometimes they met at the park. Sometimes they sat on the steps of the library because it was one of Jessie's favorite places. She said it reminded her that she was still allowed to dream. Once, she took him to a tiny corner cafe where she liked to sit and watch people when she needed to remind herself the world was bigger than her problems. Edward found himself fascinated by her. She was nothing like the women he usually dated. Polished, wealthy, always ready to network at the next charity gala. Jessie didn't care about any of that. She cared about people. She noticed things, the old man feeding pigeons on the bench, the kid drawing chalk pictures on the sidewalk, and she pointed them out to Edward like they were miracles. For the first time in years, Edward started noticing the world too. But the closer they became, the more complicated things got. One evening, Edward invited Jessie to dinner, not at a fancy restaurant, but at his apartment. He cooked for her himself, surprising even his house staff. Jessie was impressed. "You know how to cook?" "Barely," Edward admitted with a laugh. "But for you, I wanted to try." They ate together in his spacious dining room, the city skyline glowing through the glass walls behind them. Jessie looked out at the view for a long moment. "You really live like this?" "Yes," Edward said. Jessie shook her head slightly. "It's like a different planet." Edward wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, but something in her expression made him pause. "What is it?" he asked softly. Jessie hesitated, then said, "I like spending time with you. I do. But I don't know where I fit in your world." "Edward, you have everything. And I?" She trailed off, clearly embarrassed. "You think that matters to me?" Edward asked gently. "It matters to everyone eventually," Jessie said, her voice tight. "People talk. They look at me like I don't belong anywhere near you. And maybe they're right." Edward felt a flare of anger. Not at her, but at the world that had made her feel that way. "Jessie, listen to me. I don't care what they say. I care about you." Jessie looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she smiled, though it was a sad smile. "I want to believe that." After dinner, Edward drove her back to the shelter. But when they arrived, there was a crowd outside. The shelter had been forced to close temporarily due to a pipe bursting. There would be no beds tonight. Jessie's shoulders slumped. "Come stay at my place," Edward said without thinking. Jessie froze. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because," she shook her head, "because it would feel like crossing some invisible line. Like I'd owe you something." Edward took a deep breath. "Jessie, I'm not asking for anything. I just don't want you to be out here tonight." After a long pause, Jessie nodded. "Just tonight," she said. Edward drove her back to his apartment, where he offered her the guest room. Jessie stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the clean white sheets, the soft lighting, the quiet hum of the city outside. "No one's ever done this for me before," she said quietly. Edward's chest ached. "Get some rest," he said gently. That night, Edward lay awake thinking about her sleeping just a few doors away. He realized something terrifying and undeniable. He was falling in love with her. The next morning, he made them breakfast, and Jessie surprised him by laughing at his slightly burned toast. For a few days, things were good. Jessie stayed with him until the shelter reopened, and during that time, Edward saw more of her spirit. The way she hummed softly while washing the dishes, the way she carefully folded the borrowed clothes he gave her, the way she looked out at the city like she was planning to conquer it someday. But then came the backlash. It started with a tabloid photo, Edward and Jessie walking together near the park. The headline called her the mystery girl who stole the billionaire's attention. Soon, reporters were showing up outside the shelter, outside Edward's building, even at the cafe Jessie loved. Jessie was furious. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said one evening, her voice shaking. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Edward said, trying to calm her. "I'll make it stop." "You can't make it stop," Jessie said bitterly. "This is your world, Edward, and now I'm in it whether I want to be or not." "Then stay in it," Edward said, almost desperate. "Stay with me." Jessie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. She left that night, going back to the shelter. Edward stood at his window, staring at the empty guest room, feeling the hollowness return to his chest. Days passed without seeing her. Edward tried to give her space, but the distance gnawed at him. Finally, he went to the shelter, only to find out that Jessie wasn't there. "She left yesterday," the receptionist said. "Didn't say where she was going." Panic gripped Edward. He called every contact he had, searched the places she used to go, even hired a private investigator. Nothing. For the first time, Edward felt truly powerless. And for the first time, he realized just how much he needed her. Edward didn't sleep much after Jessie disappeared. Days bled into nights, his work became mechanical, and every time his phone rang, he hoped it would be her. But it never was. One rainy afternoon, Edward's driver pulled up in front of a small neighborhood cafe where Edward had often seen Jessie sitting by the window. He didn't expect to find her there, but he went inside anyway, and then he saw her. She was sitting alone, a steaming cup of tea in front of her, staring out at the rain. Her hair was a little damp from the walk, her coat worn but clean. Edward's heart nearly stopped. He crossed the room in a few quick steps. "Jessie." She turned, surprise flashing across her face, followed by something more complicated. Sadness, maybe, or relief. "Edward," she said softly. He sat down across from her. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the rain pattering softly against the windows. "Why did you leave?" Edward asked quietly. Jessie's hands tightened around her cup. "Because I needed to breathe," she said. "Everything happened so fast. Suddenly, I wasn't just Jessie anymore. I was your Jessie." People taking pictures, reporters asking questions, strangers whispering about me. She shook her head. "I felt like I was losing myself." Edward reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "Jessie, I never wanted to hurt you. He stopped, realizing there was no easy way to say it. "I love you." Jessie's eyes widened, but she didn't pull her hands away. "I didn't know what that empty space inside me was until I met you," Edward continued. "You make me want to be better. You make me remember that life isn't just about money and power and deals. It's about connection, about meaning. Jessie, I don't care what the world says. I just want you." For a long moment, Jessie didn't speak. The cafe was quiet except for the rain. Finally, she whispered, "I love you too. I just don't know if love is enough when our worlds are so different." Edward opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, a loud crash came from outside, the sound of tires skidding on wet pavement. They both turned in time to see a car spinning out of control, heading straight toward the front of the cafe. Edward reacted without thinking. He grabbed Jessie and pulled her to the floor just as the car smashed into a parked vehicle, missing the cafe by mere feet. The cafe erupted in shouts and chaos, but Edward held Jessie close until he was sure it was over. When they finally stood, Jessie was trembling. Edward cupped her face in his hands. "Are you okay?" Jessie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Me too," Edward said softly. The accident was a turning point. That night, Edward insisted Jessie come back with him, not to the apartment, but to his family's estate just outside the city. Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Jessie hesitated but eventually agreed. The estate was beautiful, sprawling gardens, tall trees, a house that looked like something out of a painting. Jessie felt out of place at first, but Edward never left her side. For a few days, it felt like they were in their own world. They walked the grounds together, cooked dinner together, sat on the balcony watching the stars. Jessie began to relax, and Edward began to hope. But not everyone was happy about their growing closeness. One evening, Edward's father arrived unexpectedly, a stern man with silver hair and an impeccable suit. He looked Jesse over with thinly veiled disapproval. "Edward," he said curtly, "we need to talk." They went into the study, leaving Jesse in the living room. Through the closed door, Jesse could hear the muffled sound of voices. Edward's calm but firm, his father's sharp and angry. When Edward finally emerged, his expression was dark. "What happened?" Jesse asked quietly. Edward hesitated, then said, "He doesn't approve. He thinks being with you will damage the family's reputation." Jesse's face went pale. "He's not wrong," she said. "Edward, you've worked your whole life to build what you have. I don't want to be the reason you lose any of it." Edward took her hands, his voice steady. "Jesse, listen to me. I don't care about the board. I don't care about the press. I don't care about what my father thinks. The only thing I care about is you." Jesse's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Edward's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression changed. "What is it?" Jesse asked. "There's been a problem at the company," Edward said grimly. "A major deal is collapsing. If we don't fix it, hundreds of employees could lose their jobs." "Go," Jesse said immediately. "You have to fix it." Edward hesitated. "I don't want to leave you." "I'll be here when you get back," Jesse promised. Edward kissed her gently before leaving, his heart heavy. But while Edward was gone, Jesse began to feel the weight of everything pressing down again. The estate, the staff who looked at her like she was an intruder, the memory of Edward's father's cold eyes. Late that night, Jesse walked through the garden, staring at the stars. She loved Edward. She knew that now with absolute certainty. But love, she realized, meant wanting what was best for him, even if it meant letting him go. And when Edward returned hours later, exhausted but victorious, Jesse was gone. All she left was a note on the kitchen table. "Edward, thank you for everything. You saved me more than once, and I will always love you for that. But I can't stay in your world. I need to stand on my own 2 feet, to become someone I'm proud of before I can be with you. If it's meant to be, we'll find each other again someday." Edward sank into a chair, the note shaking in his hand. He had saved the company, but he had lost Jesse. And for the first time, Edward wondered if having everything meant nothing without the person he loved by his side. Edward sat in silence for a long time after reading Jesse's note. He had faced boardroom wars, cutthroat competitors, financial crises that would make lesser men crumble. But nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as this single sheet of paper. He read it again and again until the words blurred. Jesse hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She left because she didn't feel she was enough. Edward realized then that if he ever wanted to see her again, really see her, he had to do more than just wait. He had to change. Over the next few weeks, Edward threw himself not into work, but into something entirely different. He started visiting the shelter where Jesse used to stay, not to look for her but to help. He funded repairs to the broken pipes, upgraded the kitchen, and created a program to help residents find jobs. But Edward didn't just write checks. He showed up. He served meals. He listened to people's stories. For the first time, Edward wasn't just a man on the outside looking in. He was part of something real, something human. Word spread quickly. The press, always hungry for a headline, tried to spin the story. "Billionaire redeems himself after mystery girlfriend scandal." But Edward didn't care. This wasn't for them. It was for Jesse and for himself. Months passed. Edward missed Jesse every single day. But the work gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. Then one evening, as Edward was leaving the shelter after a long day, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Edward!" He turned so quickly it almost hurt. And there she was. Jessie stood a few feet away, her hair a little longer, her clothes a little different, but her eyes exactly the same. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of the city faded until it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "Jessie," Edward said softly. She smiled, a small, tentative smile. "I heard what you've been doing here," she said. "I had to see it for myself." Edward took a step closer. I wasn't trying to impress you. I know, Jessie said. That's why it impressed me. Edward laughed softly, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. Where have you been? Working, Jessie said. I got a job at a bookstore. I'm saving money for classes. I wanted to prove to myself that I could build something on my own. And did you? Jessie nodded. Yeah, but I still missed you every single day. Edward's chest ached. Then come back, he said. Not to the estate, not to the life I had before. Come back to this, what we're building now. Together. Jessie hesitated, tears in her eyes. Edward, I was so afraid that being with you meant losing myself. But looking at you now, she gestured at the shelter behind them. You've changed. You're not just Edward the billionaire anymore. You're Edward, the man who cares. Edward took her hands. I don't want a world where you have to choose between who you are and who you're with. I want to build a world where you can be both. Where we can be both. Jessie's tears spilled over, but she was smiling now. I want that too. They stood there in the glow of the streetlights, and for the first time, there were no cameras, no headlines, no disapproving voices. Just two people who had fought their way through fear, pride, and pain to find each other again. Edward kissed her then, not like a man desperate to hold on to something fragile, but like a man certain of what he wanted, certain of who he had become. The next weeks were a whirlwind, but this time they moved carefully. Edward didn't rush Jessie into his world. He invited her into it, piece by piece. She visited the company headquarters and met some of his team. She helped with the shelter programs, coming up with new ideas that Edward supported wholeheartedly. The public was still curious about them, of course, but Edward no longer hid Jessie away. He proudly introduced her as his partner, not as some temporary story for the tabloids. Even Edward's father eventually came around. One night, he showed up at the estate and asked to speak to Jessie privately. Jessie was nervous, but she agreed. They talked for over an hour. No one knows exactly what was said, but when they came back, Edward's father shook Jessie's hand and said, "Welcome to the family." Edward was stunned, but Jessie just smiled. "He's not as scary as he looks," she whispered later. Their love grew stronger with every challenge they overcame. Jessie moved into the apartment eventually, but she kept her job at the bookstore because she loved it. Edward respected that. More than that, he admired it. One evening, after a long day of work and volunteer meetings, Edward took Jessie back to the cafe where he had found her months earlier. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. Jessie laughed. "I'll never forget it." Edward got down on one knee right there, in the middle of the quiet cafe, with the rain softly falling outside just like that first day. "Jessie," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you once told me you didn't know if you belonged in my world. The truth is, you didn't just belong in it, you changed it. You made it better. Will you marry me?" Jessie covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The other customers applauded softly as Edward slipped the ring onto her finger. Jessie kissed him, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped to witness their happiness. Edward knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life was never perfect, but as he held Jessie's hand, he also knew that together, they could face anything. For the first time in his life, Edward wasn't just living, he was truly alive. The day of the wedding dawned bright and golden, as if the world itself had decided to celebrate Edward and Jessie. They chose not to marry at a cathedral or a luxury hotel ballroom, but in the very gardens of the shelter Edward had rebuilt. The place that had brought them together, torn them apart, and ultimately led them back to each other. Rows of simple white chairs lined the pathway. Draped in soft flowers Jessie had picked herself. The guests were a mix of Edward's family, his closest colleagues, shelter residents, bookstore co-workers, and volunteers. A gathering that perfectly represented the two worlds Edward and Jessie had worked so hard to merge. Edward stood at the front, dressed in a tailored suit but with no trace of the arrogant businessman he had once been. His heart pounded as he waited, but when the music began and Jessie appeared, everything else faded. She walked slowly, her white dress simple but elegant, her hair loose and shining in the sunlight. She wasn't just beautiful. She was radiant, alive, glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. When Jessie reached him, Edward took her hands and whispered, "You're more beautiful than I ever imagined." "And you," Jessie whispered back, smiling through tears, "are more you than you've ever been." The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Edward and Jessie spoke their own vows. Edward's voice was steady as he said, "Jessie, you walked into my life when I least expected it. You asked me for food, but what you really gave me was something far greater, a reason to be more than I was. You reminded me that love isn't just about what we give or what we take. It's about who we become together. I promise to keep becoming, with you, every single day." Jessie's voice trembled as she spoke. "Edward, you saw me when no one else did. You didn't just give me food, you gave me dignity. You gave me a chance to dream again. You showed me that even though we came from different worlds, we could build a new one together. One where kindness matters more than money, and love matters most of all. I promise to walk beside you, through every storm and every sunrise, for as long as I live." When the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Edward didn't hesitate. He kissed Jessie as their friends and family cheered, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. But the surprises weren't over. As the reception began, Edward stood to make a toast. "Today isn't just about Jessie and me," he said. "It's about all of us. Because love is not something you keep locked away. It's something you share." He then announced that he was starting a new foundation, one that would fund shelters, job programs, and education opportunities across the city, all in honor of Jessie and the day they first met. Jessie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. She stood and kissed him, to the sound of applause and cheers. As night fell, fairy lights lit up the garden, and music filled the air. Edward and Jessie danced under the stars, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by their journey. For Edward, this was more than a wedding. It was the culmination of a transformation. He was no longer just a wealthy man with everything money could buy. He was a man with purpose, with love, with a future that mattered. And for Jessie, this was more than a happy ending. It was proof that she had never been less than. She had always been enough, and more. When the last song played, Edward pulled Jessie close and whispered, "Do you realize this is just the beginning?" Jessie smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "I hope so, because I can't wait to see what we build next." And as they stood together under the glowing lights, the guests clapping and laughing around them, it was clear that their love had become something larger than themselves. A light that would keep shining, guiding not just their own lives but the lives of everyone lucky enough to witness it. Edward kissed Jessie again, and for the first time since the day she had walked into his life, he felt completely whole. Not because he had found someone to complete him, but because together, they had created something greater than either of them could have imagined. And so their story, which had begun with a single moment on a rainy sidewalk, ended not with an ending at all, but with a promise. A promise that love, when it is true, will always find a way.